No one ever looked twice at the man in coveralls hunched under the hood of an old truck, but maybe they should have. Because tucked away at the edge of a rundown trailer park outside Woodbury, there lived a man whose hands once helped design the very future of automotive engineering. And now those same hands were trying to keep a rusted lawnmower running for a neighbor who paid him in stew and kind words. Charles Hartman didn't talk about the life he had before. Not to his neighbors, not even to his daughter. Most folks just saw a tired man with oil-stained jeans, calloused fingers, and a worn-out back from crawling under too many engines for too little money. But if you listened close, if you watched how his fingers moved like they still remembered precision, how his eyes locked onto every fault in a machine with laser focus, you'd understand. This wasn't just some guy scraping by. This was someone who'd once touched greatness and been burned by it. The trailer he called home was at the far end of Willow Lane, a narrow path of gravel and cracked pavement lined with single wides that had all seen better days. Charles's place stood out only for two things: a tiny vegetable garden, stubbornly green in the dusty soil, and a makeshift workshop built from salvaged plywood and a sagging blue tarp. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left after life had taken everything else. Inside, the trailer was spotless, almost clinical in its organization. Every tool had its place. Every surface was scrubbed clean. The walls bore fading photographs. A young Charles in a lab coat, smiling with colleagues beside a prototype engine. A wedding photo with Sarah, his late wife, her eyes bright with dreams. And of course Amelia, as a baby, as a little girl in overalls, holding a wrench nearly as big as her arm. Charles rarely smiled these days, but when he looked at those photos, especially the ones of Amelia, something softened in his expression. That's why he kept going. It was early morning, the sun barely pushing through the low-hanging clouds, when Charles crouched beside Mrs. Peterson's beat-up Chevy, methodically replacing an alternator that should have given out 5 years ago. His knees ached, his back screamed, and his work shirt, once navy, was now faded to gray, stitched with more patches than fabric. Yet his hands moved with certainty, each motion practiced and precise. Mrs. Peterson, a 75-year-old widow who lived 2 lots down, watched from her porch with a steaming thermos of coffee in hand. "You're a godsend, Charlie," she said, not for the first time. "Don't know what this place would do without you." Charles grunted a modest thanks, wiped sweat from his brow, and turned the last bolt. The engine came to life on the first try, the hum smooth and steady. For a moment, even the birds seemed to pause and listen. When she tried to hand him a folded 20 and the thermos, Charles hesitated. That 20 meant gas money, maybe groceries, but also it meant pride, independence. He took it with a nod, pocketing the bill like it didn't matter, but he felt the weight of it anyway. He always did. As he gathered his tools, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Amelia. "Dad, science comp reg fee due tomorrow, $50. Sorry." He stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the keyboard to reply, then dropped. What could he say? They both knew the money wasn't there. Not yet. Charles was used to pressure, but not this kind. The slow, crushing kind that didn't come from a busted piston or a ticking valve, but from living one emergency away from collapse. He'd been a father longer than he'd been an engineer now. Sarah's illness had made sure of that. When she passed, everything had changed. The big house, the research grants, the promising career, all gone. He sold the car, sold the furniture, sold the tools he couldn't bear to lose. And then he packed what was left into a truck and drove with Amelia until the road narrowed and their luck ran out. That's how they ended up at Woodbury Meadows. Not by choice, by necessity. Still, Charles never complained, not out loud. Not even when the rent was raised again, or when the check engine light came back on in his own truck for the 3rd time that month, or when Amelia skipped lunch at school because she didn't want him to worry. He just worked, fixed what he could, endured what he couldn't, and if you asked him why, he'd just point to Amelia. She was the reason he was still upright. 16 years old, brilliant, brave, and somehow still full of hope. She talked about fuel efficiency like other kids talked about music or makeup. She was going to be an engineer. She was, no matter what he had to do to make it happen. And on this morning, as he walked the 5 minutes back to their trailer with $20 and a thermos, Charles didn't know that fate was already shifting, that a car had broken down just a few miles up the road, that a name on a hood ornament would spark a chain reaction, that within 24 hours everything would change. But for now, he just pushed open the screen door, stepped inside their little home, and prepared to chase one more job, one more shot at holding it all together before it slipped through his fingers again. The moment Charles stepped back into the trailer, the contrast between the cool morning air and the dry, stuffy interior hit him like a wall. He set the thermos down on the chipped counter and reached for the light switch, though he didn't need to. He knew the layout of every inch of the place by heart. Amelia had left her usual trail of school papers across the kitchen table, her carefully annotated notes and half-finished mechanical sketches competing for space with a pile of unpaid bills. Charles picked up a folded piece of paper and recognized the red stamp even before he read it. Final notice. He placed it gently back down, as if touching it too hard might make something worse. The refrigerator groaned when he opened it, revealing a carton of milk with one good day left, a few eggs and half a loaf of bread. He stared for a moment, then closed the door. There was no time for breakfast anyway. His phone buzzed again. It was that same message from Amelia, glowing up at him like an accusation he didn't deserve but couldn't argue with. "Dad, science comp reg fee due tomorrow. $50. Sorry." He read it again, then again, like somehow the meaning would shift if he looked hard enough. But it didn't. It never did. Amelia didn't mean anything by it. She always apologized when asking for money, even though she never asked for anything frivolous. Her requests were always tied to her dreams, and that made it even harder. This wasn't a kid asking for sneakers or concert tickets. This was a girl asking for a chance to chase something bigger than this life. And $50 might as well have been $5,000. He thumbed through the small stack of crumpled bills in his pocket. $20 from Mrs. Peterson, a 10 he'd been saving for gas, 7 singles from a side job last week. It was like holding broken pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't come together, no matter how hard he pressed. Charles had done the math a dozen times. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and he was still behind. The electricity bill hovered like a guillotine, and the truck's tank was flirting with empty. Every dollar had a destination, and none of them led to relief. Outside, the sound of gravel crunching under tires reminded him that the rest of the world was already in motion. He needed to find more work, and fast. But the thing about being a freelance handyman in a town like Woodbury was that everyone needed help, and almost no one could pay. He checked his phone for messages. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts, no job offers. Just that one message from Amelia, hanging there like a weight on his chest. A knock came at the door, and for a moment, Charles allowed himself to hope. Maybe someone needed a repair. Maybe someone had cash. But it was just Benjamin Lopez, his neighbor 2 trailers down, wearing his factory uniform and looking like he hadn't slept much either. "Tom Parker's making the rounds again," Benjamin said, not bothering with small talk. "He says evictions start next week for anyone more than 2 months behind." Charles rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the dull ache where stress had made a permanent home. "I'm only 6 weeks behind," he muttered, though the difference felt meaningless. "I've got a couple jobs lined up. I'll make a payment by Friday." Benjamin hesitated, shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other. "Look, I've got some overtime this week, if you need a little help." "No," Charles cut in gently but firmly. "You've got your own family to take care of?" It wasn't pride exactly. It was that same instinct that kept him from taking more than $20 from Mrs. Peterson or letting Amelia see how close the edge really was. If he started relying on others, it meant admitting he couldn't keep them afloat. And if he couldn't protect Amelia, what was left? After Benjamin left, Charles sat down at the table, staring at Amelia's notes spread across it. She'd been working on a project about alternative fuel systems, something about optimizing combustion to reduce emissions while maintaining power output. It was ambitious, complex, and way beyond what most high schoolers even attempted. But then again, Amelia wasn't most high schoolers. She'd always been different, sharp-eyed, curious, and unafraid of challenge. Sarah used to say she'd be a better engineer than both of them someday, and she wasn't wrong. The registration fee for the science competition wasn't optional. It was Amelia's shot to get noticed by scholarship boards, by colleges, by people who could offer her a future beyond this trailer park. Charles knew that. So he stood, grabbed his tools, and made a list in his head of who might need something fixed. He couldn't wait for work to find him. He had to go and chase it down, the way he had chased everything since Sarah died. The knock on the door had been a reminder, the message from Amelia, a call to action. Charles left the trailer and stepped back into the world, the weight of uncertainty pressing hard against his ribs, but the drive to do right by his daughter pushing harder. Somewhere out there was $50, maybe $100 if he got lucky, enough to keep the lights on, enough to keep the promise he made to a dying wife, enough to remind Amelia that dreams didn't have to die in places like Woodbury Meadows. The road out of Woodbury was one long stretch of cracked asphalt bordered by brittle grass and rusting fence posts. It was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. Charles Hartman didn't usually take that route in the evenings unless he had a job. This time it was a call from a farmer on the outskirts of town whose tractor had stalled mid-harvest. The money wasn't great, but it would be enough to patch the hole left by Amelia's competition fee. Maybe even leave a few dollars for groceries. He was halfway there when the engine in his own truck sputtered, giving its usual warning cough. The check engine light had been on for weeks. He'd ignored it because there was nothing else to do. He didn't have the parts, or the time, or the luxury of tending to his own problems when there were bills to pay and a daughter's dreams to protect. He muttered a curse under his breath, coaxed the truck forward, and prayed it would last the night. That's when he saw it. A sleek black car, low to the ground, hazard lights blinking in the growing dusk. It sat like a spaceship on the shoulder of the road, glinting beneath the fading sun. It was clearly not from around here. Woodbury didn't breed cars like that, let alone people who drove them. As Charles slowed, he noticed the figure pacing beside it. A young woman in business attire, phone pressed to her ear, heels wobbling slightly on the uneven gravel. Her frustration was palpable, movements sharp and restless like a caged animal. She looked completely out of place, and for a second, Charles considered driving past. He was already running late. The tractor job was time-sensitive and farmers didn't have much patience for delay, besides someone like her. She probably had 3 roadside services on speed dial and a wallet fat enough to helicopter in a new car if she had to. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she kept checking her phone, as if expecting someone who wasn't coming. Maybe it was the isolated stretch of road, the sinking sun, and the long shadows creeping out from the tree line. Or maybe it was just the voice in the back of his mind, Sarah's voice, reminding him that decency didn't punch a clock. He eased the truck onto the shoulder, rolled to a stop behind the sleek black vehicle, and leaned out his window. "You all right?" he called, his voice rough from disuse and engine fumes. The woman looked up, startled, then nodded with a mix of relief and hesitation. "I'm not really sure. It just died. I've called every mechanic in town, but nobody can get here before morning." Charles studied the vehicle. It wasn't just expensive, it was rare. Sleek contours, precision angles, panels that looked like they were designed in a wind tunnel. The badge on the front read Pulse, a name he recognized immediately. The Woodward Pulse. Limited production, high-end hybrid with advanced power systems still in pre-release. He'd read about it in a trade magazine months ago, and then tossed the article aside, unable to stomach looking at the kind of future he was no longer part of. Now here it was, dead on the side of his road. "I can take a look," he offered. "I'm not exactly a dealership tech, but I've worked on plenty of systems. Couldn't hurt to try." The woman hesitated again, glancing from him to his battered truck and back to him. She was clearly sizing him up, A man in faded jeans, shirt smeared with grease, with hands that looked like they'd been through a war. Most people looked at him and saw scrapyard. He was used to that. "I'm Audrey," she said finally. "Audrey Woodward. And yes, please, I'd appreciate it." The name clicked into place. Woodward, as in Woodward Technologies, as in the Woodward who helped reshape the automotive industry with revolutionary battery systems and integrated hybrid designs. Her mother, if he remembered correctly, was the CEO. He didn't mention any of that, just stepped out of his truck, grabbed his tools, and went to work. The car's hood lifted with a soft click, revealing an engine bay that looked more like a circuit board than a traditional motor. Sleek components, tightly packed wiring, a power management module unlike anything he'd seen outside a prototype lab. This wasn't just high-tech, it was personal. Someone had designed this with care, detail, and vision. Charles felt his pulse quicken, not with nerves, but something sharper, older, muscle memory, familiarity. That buried part of him, the engineer who used to wake up excited to chase innovation, stirred as he leaned over the system and began tracing its faults. Audrey hovered beside him, watching closely. "The last mechanic I showed it to just stared and said it looked like alien tech," she said with a wry smile. Charles didn't respond. He was already immersed, eyes scanning every junction, every contact point, every thermal route. It took only a few minutes for him to spot the flaw, an overheating issue, a design oversight. The thermal regulator was misaligned with the battery transfer threshold, causing a cascade of heat stress during transition between electric and combustion. It wasn't an error most would notice, not unless they understood the principles behind the system, not unless they'd once tried to build something similar. Charles reached into his toolbox and began pulling out what he needed. "I'm going to reroute a section of the electrical frame," he explained as he worked. "That thermal regulator's overcompensating on load change. Whoever designed this probably optimized it for lab conditions, but it's not adapting to real-world heat levels." Audrey tilted her head, curious now. "How do you know that?" Charles shrugged. "Because I've made the same mistake." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. They were truer than she could possibly know. The work took him 45 minutes. No fancy diagnostics, no computer readouts, just tools, instinct, and a deep knowledge he hadn't used in years. As the sun finally dipped below the hills and dusk took over the sky, Charles closed the hood and stepped back. "Try it now," he said. Audrey got in, turned the key, and the engine purred to life. Quieter, smoother, more efficient than before. She stepped out slowly, staring at the vehicle like it had just come back from the dead. "That's better than it was when I picked it up from the factory." Charles nodded, already packing up his tools. "It'll run cleaner now. Should give you about 15% more efficiency. Maybe more, depending on how you drive." Audrey looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked, voice low, more awed than suspicious. He didn't answer right away, just tossed his wrench back into the toolbox, wiped his hands on a rag, and muttered, "Just someone who knows engines." He turned to leave, expecting the moment to end like so many others, with thanks, maybe a few dollars, and a quick goodbye. But Audrey stopped him. "Wait," she said, digging into her purse and pulling out a sleek business card. "Please, call this number tomorrow. It's mine. I want to talk more about that design flaw you noticed." Charles stared at the card, the weight of his past pressing against the possibilities of the present. And in his gut, something told him this wasn't just another roadside favor. This was a spark, the kind that lit fires, the kind that changed lives. The night was deep by the time Charles pulled his truck back into its narrow space at the end of Willow Lane. The familiar crunch of gravel under the tires barely registered as his mind spun with thoughts faster than any engine he'd ever tuned. He cut the ignition and sat in the dark, the only sound the soft ticking of the hot metal cooling under the hood. In his hand, the business card Audrey Woodward had given him seemed to burn like a coal. He tucked it into his shirt pocket after glancing at it only once, but its presence lingered, sharp and unreal, like a word you hear in a dream and wake up still repeating. Audrey hadn't just been grateful, she'd been shocked, even impressed, not because he'd fixed her car, but because he'd understood it in a way most certified engineers couldn't, and it wasn't because he was some backward savant with a lucky guess. It was because he had once lived and breathed the kind of work that built machines like that, work he hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside the trailer, the place was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge and the faint buzz of Amelia's study lamp in the other room. Her books were still spread out across the table, along with her notes, complex equations and diagrams scribbled in pencil, circled with arrows, annotated with the kind of language most high schoolers wouldn't even pretend to understand. She had clearly fallen asleep mid-sentence again, and Charles allowed himself a small, tired smile. He didn't wake her. Instead, he walked over to the table, carefully placed the $20 from Mrs. Peterson beneath her science folder, and stared at the rest of the bills scattered underneath. Due dates, red notices, late fees, each one a reminder of how close to the edge they always were. But tonight, for the first time in years, something had shifted. A possibility had cracked open, however slightly, and he couldn't stop replaying it. What if Audrey was serious? What if she did speak to her mother? Pamela Woodward wasn't just a CEO, she was an industry giant. Her name was synonymous with innovation, precision, vision. And her daughter had told her about him, Charles Hartman, the man who had once held patents that helped shape hybrid propulsion systems. The man who, 10 years ago, had been buried so deep in a corporate lawsuit that his name was scrubbed from projects he'd built from the ground up. The man who had walked away not just because he was outmatched, but because Sarah was dying and fighting for recognition suddenly seemed less important than holding her hand in those final weeks. He pulled the card from his pocket again, turned it over in the faint kitchen light. Nothing flashy, just a name, a title, and a number. It felt heavier than it should have, not physically but in meaning. It was an invitation, or maybe a test. He could throw it away, pretend tonight never happened, and get back to the business of scraping by. Or he could call the number and risk everything. Humiliation, rejection, the fragile shell of peace he'd built around the pain of his old life. Because if he knocked on that door and it slammed shut again, he wasn't sure he'd have the strength to keep trying. He stood there in silence for a long time, watching the numbers on the microwave clock change. When the hour turned, he finally moved, slowly, deliberately, putting the card inside a small tin on the top shelf of the cabinet, the same place he kept Sarah's wedding ring, the keys to the storage unit he hadn't opened in 5 years, and a folded copy of the legal settlement he had signed with Davidson Automotive, the place where he kept memories that were too valuable to toss but too painful to hold. Sleep didn't come easily. He lay on the couch, the one that doubled as his bed, and stared at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the trailer as if the world might break open while he rested. His mind kept looping back to the engine, the clean click of the connections, the elegant solution he'd found without thinking. It had felt so natural, so right, like muscle memory, like breathing. As if some locked part of him had suddenly thrown its doors open, reminding him who he used to be and whispering, "You're still that man." He'd missed that feeling more than he could admit. The clarity, the purpose, the sense that his brain mattered for something other than survival. He finally drifted off somewhere between exhaustion and obsession, but his sleep was light, broken by dreams of half-built prototypes and courtroom arguments that ended in silence. When he woke, it was to the early hiss of morning coffee percolating and Amelia's soft voice humming under her breath as she organized her papers for school. She greeted him with a quick smile and a distracted, "Morning, Dad," already lost in her own world of circuits and combustion ratios. He watched her for a moment, thinking how much of Sarah lived in that spark, the curiosity, the defiance of limits, the quiet brilliance that didn't beg to be noticed but demanded respect. Charles opened the cabinet, took out the tin, and stared at the card again. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he slipped it into his pocket. Not because he had decided anything, not yet, but because something in him had shifted. The buried fire had flickered back to life, And it wasn't just about money or jobs anymore. It was about legacy, about showing Amelia that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way forward if you're willing to take the first step. And as he walked her to the bus stop, said goodbye, and turned toward home, the number in his pocket seemed to pulse with meaning. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe Audrey would forget. Maybe Pamela would scoff at the idea of some broke trailer mechanic being anything more than a fluke. But maybe not. Maybe, just maybe, this time the door would open, and he wouldn't walk away. The morning started like every other, dim light seeping through worn blinds, the cold bite of linoleum under bare feet, the familiar rattle of a heating unit fighting to warm a space too stubborn and drafty to hold in the heat. But for Charles, something was different. He moved slower, more deliberately, like he was walking a tightrope between disbelief and anticipation. The business card in his pocket felt like it had weight, as if carrying it might tilt the balance of his day. It was absurd, really, how a piece of cardstock could carry so much tension. He hadn't even called the number yet, hadn't made a move, but the idea of what it represented refused to sit quietly in the back of his mind. He made breakfast, eggs and toast from their dwindling supplies, and set a plate in front of Amelia without a word. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. Her eyes flicked up from her project folder, and she tilted her head. "You okay?" she asked between bites, her voice casual but her gaze sharp. "Fine," Charles answered too quickly, sipping his coffee and looking out the window as if the answer might be out there, hidden between the trees. "Just thinking." She didn't push. She knew his silences well enough to understand that sometimes the best support was space. Instead, she returned to her notes, pencil scratching as she scribbled something about torque conversion rates and energy loss curves. After she left for school, Charles sat alone at the table, staring at his phone. The number on the card wasn't saved to his contacts, but he didn't need to look at it again to remember. It was already etched into his brain. He picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the keypad, and then set it down. Stood up, walked to the sink, washed a dish that didn't need washing, walked back. Saturday picked it up again. It wasn't fear exactly. It was scale. The realization that if he made this call, and it went well, his life might not just change. It might turn inside out. He had lived 10 years defined by limitation, by survival. What would it even mean to step beyond that? Eventually he forced himself to dial. The ringtone sounded louder than it should have in the quiet trailer. Once, twice, a third time, then a voice, crisp, alert, vaguely surprised. "Audrey Woodward," Charles cleared his throat. "Ms. Woodward, this is Charles Hartman. You helped me find a design flaw in your car yesterday. You said—" "Yes," she interrupted, recognition sparking instantly. "Yes, I remember. Thank you for calling. I've actually been waiting. I spoke with my mother last night. She wants to meet you." Charles blinked, not entirely sure he'd heard her correctly. "Meet me?" "Yes, she was very interested. I told her what you did. Not just that you fixed it, but how. She wants to talk to you about some of the problems her team's been working on. She said she wants to see for herself." The words didn't land all at once. It was like she was speaking a language he hadn't heard in years, a dialect of opportunity, curiosity, recognition. He sat down heavily, phone pressed to his ear, gripping it like it might slip through his fingers. "When?" he asked. "Today," Audrey replied. "This morning. She's in town and asked for directions to your home. I hope that's okay. I gave her your address." For a long moment, Charles didn't speak. He could barely breathe. "She's coming here?" "In a helicopter," Audrey added, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "She doesn't like to waste time." Charles hung up with a thank you that barely reached the surface of his spinning thoughts. He stood, frozen in the kitchen, trying to absorb what had just happened. Outside, the wind rustled dry leaves across the gravel, the sky still painted with soft morning haze. Inside, Charles looked around his trailer and saw it differently. Worn linoleum, second-hand furniture, framed photos with cracked glass. It was his whole world. And in less than an hour, one of the most powerful women in the industry was going to step into it. He moved into motion without thinking, like a man bracing for a storm. He changed into his cleanest pair of jeans, a shirt with fewer holes, ran a wet comb through his hair and scrubbed at the oil beneath his nails. Nothing could hide the truth of his life, but maybe he could soften the edges. He tidied the table, swept the floor, rearranged the stack of Amelia's textbooks, then paused at the wall of family photos. For a second, he considered taking them down. Then he stopped himself. This was his life. If Pamela Woodward wanted to meet him, she could meet all of him. A soft knock came at the door, and before Charles could even reach for the handle, Benjamin Lopez appeared at the side window, wide-eyed and breathless. "Charlie," he said, waving toward the field, "you gotta come see this." Charles stepped outside and followed Benjamin's gaze. The sound came first, deep and rhythmic, like thunder rippling across the sky. Then the sight of it, breaking through the tree line, a sleek, black helicopter with a shining chrome underbelly and the unmistakable logo of Woodward Technologies emblazoned on the side. It descended in a graceful arc toward the field behind the trailer park, blades slicing the air, kicking up leaves and dust in swirling circles. People poured out of their trailers, neighbors, kids, the occasional dog barking in confusion, as the chopper touched down on the community field. It was a spectacle unlike anything Woodbury Meadows had ever seen. The roar of the rotors seemed to shake the ground. Even Warren Schmidt stood outside his garage, arms folded, staring in disbelief. Charles couldn't move. He felt rooted to the earth, watching as the door to the helicopter opened and a woman in a sharply tailored charcoal suit stepped out. She moved with poise, each step calm and precise, her silver-streaked hair catching the morning light like a crown. Pamela Woodward looked nothing like the executives Charles remembered from his old life. There was no arrogance in her face, no smirk of superiority, just focus, calm, control. She scanned the rows of trailers with an assessing gaze until her eyes found him, and then she walked straight toward him, hand extended. "Mr. Hartman," she said, "I believe we have some things to talk about." And just like that, the quiet, invisible man of Woodbury Meadows became the center of an unfolding story no one in the trailer park would soon forget. The air inside the Rise and Shine diner was thick with the scent of coffee and the faint undercurrent of frying bacon, but Charles barely noticed as he followed Pamela Woodward to a booth near the back window. The place hadn't changed in years. Same laminated menus, same cracked vinyl booths, same waitress behind the counter who offered a stunned double-take when she caught sight of Pamela's designer suit and silk scarf. Charles offered a small nod to Judy behind the counter, who blinked twice before reaching for the coffee pot, like refilling his mug might somehow explain the surreal tableau she was witnessing. A helicopter landing at Woodbury Meadows was the kind of thing people would talk about for months. That the passenger had come looking for him, that part would become legend. Pamela slid into the booth with practiced ease, setting a sleek leather folio on the table in front of her. She moved like someone used to commanding boardrooms, but there was no condescension in her gaze, just sharp interest, like she was assembling puzzle pieces in real time, and Charles was one of them. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Audrey told me what you did to her vehicle," she said, folding her hands over the folio. "She said it wasn't just a fix. She said you improved the engine, that you identified a flaw our engineers missed." Charles reached for his coffee, trying to buy himself a few seconds of composure. He'd rehearsed 100 ways this conversation might go, but now that he was sitting across from her, none of them felt right. "I didn't mean to step on anyone's toes," he said finally. "I just saw a heat misalignment. Thermal load was causing stress at the transition junction. Anyone with enough field experience might have noticed the same thing." Pamela studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with one fingertip, she pushed the folio across the table toward him. "I had my team pull everything they could find on you after Audrey called. You're not just anyone with field experience." Charles glanced at the folio but didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew what it would contain. his name on a series of patents, old photos from his days at Davidson Automotive, a resume that had once been promising, then went dark around 2015. That was a long time ago, he said, and not exactly a highlight reel. Pamela didn't flinch. That's one way to look at it. Another is that you helped design some of the most advanced hybrid power systems in the country before you got blackballed by a corporation afraid of what you knew. Charles gave a short laugh, more bitterness than humor. I filed a lawsuit, he said. They had more money, more lawyers. I didn't stand a chance, and by the time I realized how badly I was losing, my wife was in the hospital. Stage 4. Everything else stopped mattering. Pamela's posture softened just slightly. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, and there was enough weight in her voice that Charles believed she meant it. But it wasn't the end of your story. He looked out the window for a long moment, watching the wind shift the trees outside, the clouds casting restless shadows over the parking lot. After Sarah died, I tried to rebuild. I applied everywhere, sent out letters, emails, even cold called some places. But Davidson made sure no one would touch me. Too long out of the industry. Skills outdated. That's what they said, even when I offered to consult for free, just to get my foot back in the door. He paused. I got tired of fighting for a seat at a table that didn't want me, so I made my own table. Small, wobbly, but mine. Pamela opened the folio and slid out a single sheet of paper. Then, maybe it's time for a better table, she said, with proper legs. She placed the document between them. At the top, it read, Offer of Employment, Woodward Technologies. Charles didn't move. His eyes skimmed the words, the numbers. It was more than generous. It was transformative. A salary that would erase his debts. Benefits that would have changed Sarah's last year. Educational support for Amelia. A relocation package. A title, Director of Innovation. It felt like something from someone else's life. He sat back, folding his arms. Why me? He asked. Really, you've got a dozen engineers more current than I am. People who haven't been out of the game for a decade. Pamela smiled, thin, deliberate, confident. Because you saw a flaw in a system that hundreds of qualified people missed. Because you fixed it without specialized equipment. Because Audrey came home and said, this man knew more about our car than the people who built it. She leaned forward slightly. And because I have a personal interest in stealing talent away from Edward Davidson every chance I get. Charles raised an eyebrow. I didn't realize you two had history. We don't, she said. Not really. But I've watched his company profit from the work of others for years. It's a rotten culture, and it infects everything it touches. I'm trying to build something different. She gestured to the document. You're not just a mechanic, Mr. Hartman. You're an engineer with vision. That's the kind of person I want leading my team. Charles felt the edges of the world tilt. For so long, he had been defined by scarcity, of opportunity, of security, of belief. This offer wasn't just a lifeline. It was a mirror being held up to the man he used to be, asking if that man was still in there somewhere, beneath the fatigue and the failure. I'd need time, he said. My daughter's still in school. We'd have to move, adjust. Pamela nodded. Of course, we're not asking you to uproot everything overnight, but I need an answer within the week. The next phase of the Pulse project is about to launch, and I want you leading it. The booth fell silent. Outside, the town was waking up. School buses rumbling down side streets, shop doors opening, people going about their lives with no idea that inside a quiet diner, a man was being offered a new one. Charles stared at the document again, then folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. I'll think about it, he said. Talk to Amelia. We've got roots here. Not deep ones, maybe, but real. Pamela's gaze softened. Real roots can be transplanted, she said, especially if you're planting them in better soil. As they stood and walked toward the door, Pamela paused beside the register, pulling out her phone. There's one more thing, she said. Something I want to show you before I leave town. Charles followed her outside, where the black SUV waited, polished and still gleaming from its earlier trip across the sky. "Where are we going?" he asked. Pamela gave him a small, unreadable smile. "Back to your trailer," she said. "The field behind it, specifically." "Why?" "You'll see," she answered, and climbed into the back seat. Charles stood there for a second, heart beating louder than seemed reasonable. He wasn't a man easily surprised, but something told him that whatever was coming next wasn't just a formality. It was a message, a statement. And as he climbed into his own battered truck to follow the SUV back to Woodbury Meadows, he realized that his life, quiet, buried, restrained, had already begun to move. The question wasn't whether the world would accept him again. The question was whether he was ready to say yes. When Charles turned onto Willow Lane with the black SUV ahead of him, the sight of his trailer park struck him in a new way. The gravel crunching beneath his tires, the sagging fences, the faded paint on mobile homes patched with duct tape and tarps. It was all achingly familiar, but now he saw it through a lens sharpened by possibility. As he approached his unit, he spotted Amelia standing barefoot on the front steps, still in her pajamas, her hair pulled up in a messy bun, holding her phone with a furrowed brow. When she caught sight of the sleek SUV gliding to a stop beside their lot, her confusion deepened. Charles parked and got out quickly. He could see the questions forming on her face before she even opened her mouth. "Dad, what's going on? Is that—" Her voice trailed off as the back door of the SUV opened and Pamela Woodward stepped out. Amelia's eyes widened. The pieces clicked together in her brain with the speed and precision he'd come to expect from her. "You're the woman from the company," she said, her voice quiet with awe. Pamela smiled and offered her hand. "Pamela Woodward, you must be Amelia. I've heard quite a bit about you." Amelia shook her hand, still staring, then glanced at Charles with wide, questioning eyes. "Dad, what is she doing here?" Charles reached out and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Ms. Woodward offered me a job," he said, "a big one, head of innovation at her company." Amelia's mouth fell open. "Wait, what? Innovation? You mean like real engineering?" Pamela interjected gently. "Not only that, but I also took the liberty of looking into your daughter's recent science project. Audrey mentioned it. Her work on alternative fuel efficiency caught our attention. I spoke to some colleagues at Brighton University and, well, Amelia, you've been offered a full scholarship to their summer engineering program." Amelia blinked, stunned. "What? No way. That program only picks 12 kids a year." Pamela smiled. "And you're one of them. The invitation should have arrived by now. Check your messages." Amelia fumbled for her phone, scrolling quickly, then gasped. "It's here, an official email. They want me to present my project at the university." She looked up, almost breathless. "Dad, is this really happening?" Charles nodded slowly. "Looks like it is." Pamela turned to them both. "If you're ready, I'd like to show you something. It's a bit unconventional." Charles exchanged a glance with Amelia, then they followed Pamela around the side of the trailer, through the narrow gravel path that led to the open community field behind the park. The grass was patchy and dry, the swing set rusted and creaking in the morning breeze. A few children played nearby, pausing their game to stare when they saw the trio approaching. An elderly man walking a small dog stopped in his tracks. Pamela checked her watch, looked up at the sky and smiled. "Right on time." The thumping began softly, distant and rhythmic. It grew louder with each passing second, sending vibrations through the ground. Charles felt it in his chest before he saw it. Then, breaking through the tree line like a scene from a film, the same helicopter from earlier came into view, cutting through the air with a fierce, focused energy. The kids in the field screamed in delight. Neighbors emerged from their trailers, shading their eyes and gawking. The helicopter circled once, then descended toward the open grass, kicking up dust and dry leaves in a swirling cyclone. Charles and Amelia stood side by side, hands shielding their eyes as the wind whipped around them. The pilot inside gave a thumbs up. The rotors slowed but didn't stop entirely. Pamela raised her voice over the noise. "This is your transportation to Brighton Heights. I thought you might like a tour of our facility before making any decisions. I find that seeing a place from the air helps put things in perspective." Charles stared at her, blinking against the wind. "You flew a helicopter to a trailer park for a tour?" Pamela's voice didn't waver. "Time is money, Mr. Hartman, and I believe in making bold moves." Amelia grabbed her father's arm, eyes shining. "Can I come too?" Pamela smiled. "I was counting on it. In fact, our first stop will be the university's engineering department. Your scholarship packet is already waiting." Charles hesitated. All around them their neighbors stared in astonishment. Warren Schmidt stood outside his garage with his mouth hanging open, and one of his mechanics gestured toward Charles in disbelief. Benjamin Lopez gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up from across the lot. Everything about the moment felt surreal, extravagant, even manipulative, but he couldn't deny the thrill racing through his blood. He turned to Amelia, who was practically bouncing with excitement, and the decision made itself. "Give us 10 minutes to change," he said. Pamela nodded. "The helicopter isn't going anywhere." Inside the trailer, the air was electric with adrenaline. Amelia rifled through her clothes, grabbing a dress shirt and slacks she had only worn once for a school presentation. Charles reached into the back of his tiny closet and pulled out his one good button-down shirt, something that had survived from his days at Davidson, a little too big now, but still intact. As they changed, Amelia kept stealing glances at him, a mixture of joy and disbelief on her face. "This is insane," she whispered, in the best way. Charles adjusted the collar on his shirt and smiled. "Let's hope the inside of that building lives up to the view from the sky." When they stepped back outside, a crowd had gathered. The helicopter sat gleaming on the grass, still roaring gently, still impossibly out of place. Pamela stood waiting, calm as ever. She waved them forward, and Charles took Amelia's hand as they walked toward it, the crowd parting for them like a tide. Every step felt like a crossing, out of the past, out of the shadows, into something new. As the pilot helped Amelia aboard, Charles took one last look at the trailer that had been their shelter and their prison, the worn home they had rebuilt from broken dreams. Then he climbed in after her, the rotors spinning faster once again. As the helicopter rose, Woodbury Meadows grew smaller beneath them. The rows of trailers looked like tiny rectangles, the broken roads like toy tracks. From the sky, the poverty faded, replaced by something cleaner, simpler, a memory. Amelia pressed her face to the window, her mouth open in wonder. Charles sat back, the warmth of her shoulder against his, and closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe the view from above didn't change the truth of where you came from, but it sure did make you believe in where you could go next. The helicopter touched down on a rooftop helipad, etched with the sleek insignia of Woodward Technologies. An elegant W encircled by a stylized gear. As the rotors spun down and the blades gradually slowed, the thrum in Charles's chest refused to match the deceleration. His heartbeat was loud and insistent, thudding with disbelief, hope, and a strange anticipation that bordered on fear. Amelia sat across from him, gripping her seat with wide eyes, her ponytail tousled from the ride. She looked out the tinted windows and let out a soft, breathless laugh. "Dad, we're on the roof." Charles nodded slowly, unable to form words. The last time he'd set foot in a building like this, he wore a lab coat, not second-hand shoes, and a shirt that barely qualified as business casual. The last time he'd been an engineer in name, before life took everything and folded it inward. The helicopter door opened with a hiss, and Pamela stood, gesturing for them to follow. "Welcome to Brighton Heights," she said simply. Her voice was calm, but Charles sensed it again. That quiet pride, the assurance of someone who had built something remarkable and now wanted to share it with people who might truly understand. They stepped onto the helipad, where the city's skyline unfolded around them like a promise. Steel and glass towers gleamed in the sun, highways curved like ribbons below, and the distant shimmer of the university campus broke the green sprawl with its red rooftops and stately white columns. Charles took a deep breath. He hadn't realized how small his world had become until this moment. They crossed into the main building through a glass-enclosed walkway, every inch designed with intentional precision. It wasn't just a corporate headquarters, it was a temple to innovation. The curved hallways were lined with interactive digital displays showing current projects, ongoing research, breakthrough timelines. Employees passed by in sleek uniforms, some in tailored suits, others in lab gear, all moving with purpose. Not once did someone stop to gawk at Charles's worn shoes or Amelia's wrinkled slacks. Here, it seemed, what you wore mattered less than what you could do. Jason Reynolds, a young engineer in his 20s with sharp eyes and eager energy, met them in the atrium. "Ms. Woodward," he said, offering her a respectful nod. "Everything's prepared. The team is already assembling in Lab 2 for the demo." Pamela turned to Charles. "Jason will give you the tour. I need to join a board session, but I'll rejoin you in the lab." She looked at Amelia with a smile. "And you, young lady, are in for a treat. This place has every tool a budding engineer could dream of." With that, she disappeared down a hall, flanked with frosted glass and security scanners, her heels clicking in a rhythm that somehow set the pace for the entire floor. Jason turned to Charles and Amelia, his enthusiasm barely contained. "You have no idea how excited everyone is to meet you, Mr. Hartman. I heard about the Pulse prototype. Nobody's shut up about it since Audrey called." Charles chuckled awkwardly. "I just saw something no one else did. Doesn't mean I'm a miracle worker." Jason grinned. "No, but maybe you're the kind of engineer who sees in 4 dimensions while the rest of us are still fiddling with schematics." He led them down a series of corridors and into an elevator that whisked them silently to the 3rd floor. When the doors opened, Charles found himself staring into a lab that could have been lifted straight out of his dreams. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a living organism. Rows of clean benches with modular parts, holographic blueprints displayed in the air, 3D printers whirring quietly in corners, and an enormous transparent whiteboard covered in diagrams and equations. A dozen engineers worked in quiet concentration, and a massive, partially disassembled prototype sat at the center of it all, like a sculpture mid-creation. "This is our main innovation suite," Jason said, leading them in. "Pulse R&D is headquartered here. The prototype Audrey was driving is based on the Gen 4 configuration, but we're currently preparing for Gen 5. Efficiency targets are 30% higher. Our main problem has been heat regulation during power transitions, until, well, you." Charles walked slowly toward the prototype, his hands twitching with the urge to touch, to examine, to fix. Amelia kept close to his side, her eyes bouncing between workstations and displays. She whispered, "Dad, this is insane. Look at the calibration tools. That's thermal mapping software I've only seen in online demos." Charles didn't respond. He was already lost in the language of machines, reading the story written by the components in front of him. Every bolt, every bracket, every vent told him something. And it was like coming home. Jason gave them space, watching with admiration as Charles stepped forward and gently ran his fingers along the copper sheath wires of the Pulse prototype. "Can I?" Charles asked. Jason nodded enthusiastically. "Please, be our guest." Charles leaned in, examining the configuration that he had instinctively corrected on the roadside. Now, in its full form, he saw how rushed some of the thermal control pathways were. The inefficiencies were subtle, but they compounded under stress, like hairline fractures in a bridge. He murmured more to himself than to anyone. They went with a double-loop capacitor instead of an offset regulator. That explains the late-stage heat spike, but if we reroute the overflow directly into the passive cooling core, it could stabilize without adding drag. Amelia stood beside him, staring at the same panel. "You'd need to isolate the secondary conduit or it'll trigger feedback in the transition cycle." Charles smiled. "Exactly. You see it?" She nodded slowly, her expression stunned. "I think so." Jason stared at them like he was witnessing a symphony no one else could hear. "Okay, now I really see where she gets it," he said. This This is why Pamela's so excited. You two don't just get this, you live it. For the next hour, Charles and Amelia moved through the lab, speaking with engineers, inspecting designs, and making suggestions that sparked actual conversations the team hadn't had yet. They weren't there to impress, they weren't posturing, they were just solving problems because it was what they loved. And gradually, the initial curiosity in the room shifted. The skepticism that sometimes greeted outsiders softened into genuine respect. When Pamela returned, she found Charles at a digital whiteboard, sketching an alternate thermal management model while half the team watched. Amelia sat nearby with a group of younger engineers who listened as she explained how she had reverse-engineered a fuel efficiency algorithm using only her school's lab equipment and recycled materials. Pamela said nothing at first, just observed. And when Charles finally turned and saw her standing there, he straightened, suddenly self-conscious. "I got carried away," he said. "Didn't mean to take over." Pamela shook her head, smiling. "Please, this is exactly what I hope to see. You're not just fitting in, you're leading, and I haven't even made the formal offer yet." Charles glanced around the room, then down at Amelia, who was still animatedly answering a question about voltage consistency. "We're not used to this," he said. "It feels unreal." Pamela stepped closer. "Then let me make it real. The job is yours, Charles. Everything we discussed at the diner, salary, benefits, relocation, educational support for Amelia, it's all in writing, and legal has finalized the paperwork." She handed him a folder. "We can start whenever you're ready." He held the folder like it might vanish if he blinked too fast. For years, every door had been locked, every opportunity just out of reach. Now, one was standing wide open, not because of luck, not because of pity, but because he'd earned it with his hands, his mind, his instincts. He looked at Pamela, then at his daughter, then back again. "We'll need to finish out Amelia's school year," he said slowly. "And I want to make sure we don't just jump without thinking." Pamela nodded. "Of course, take the weekend, talk it through. But if today's any indication, this isn't just a job offer. It's the next chapter of your story, and I think it's going to be a good one." Charles exhaled, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a decade. A knot of shame, fear, and resignation that had kept him small. He looked around the lab one last time and imagined himself here, every day, building again, not just machines, but a future. And for the first time in a long, long while, he believed that future was waiting. That evening, back at their modest trailer in Woodbury Meadows, Charles sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the sunset had left streaks of fire red and gold across the sky. The silence around him was familiar, too familiar in fact. It was the same silence that had accompanied every missed opportunity, every unanswered job application. Every day he watched Amelia do without because he couldn't do more. But tonight, the silence felt different. It didn't press down on his chest. It lifted something instead, like the stillness before a storm, but this time he wasn't waiting for disaster. He was waiting for change. Inside, Amelia was sprawled across the kitchen table, flipping through the glossy packet from Brighton University like it was a treasure map. She read every line out loud, then reread the ones that didn't seem real. Her excitement filled the small space, bouncing off the walls like light in a prism. "Dad, look," she said for the 5th time. "They're giving me access to a real engineering lab, like actual 3D modeling systems and fuel cell prototypes. Not a kit, not a simulation, real stuff. This isn't just a summer program, this is..." She stopped herself, overwhelmed by the weight of it. "It's everything." Charles stepped back inside, set his mug on the counter and leaned against the sink. He watched her for a long moment, taking in the spark in her eyes, the confidence building in her voice. She had spent years hiding her brilliance behind humility and circumstance, never wanting to draw attention to what she didn't have. But now she was glowing. "You deserve this," he said quietly. She looked up. "So do you," she replied without hesitation. "You know that, right? You've been playing small because you had to, but you don't have to anymore." He nodded, but the decision still weighed heavy on him, not because of fear, at least not the old kind, but because of how much it all meant. He wasn't just changing jobs, he was changing lives, theirs, and maybe others too. That night, while Amelia fell asleep with the university packet still open beside her pillow, Charles sat by the kitchen window and stared out at the blinking trailer park lights. He didn't know what time it was when he finally opened the folder Pamela had handed him. The official offer letter was neatly printed, clear, undeniable. He read it once, twice, 3 times, letting every word settle. The next morning came early. Too early, but Charles was up before dawn, making eggs and toast and boiling water for tea, Amelia's preferred preschool ritual. She stumbled into the kitchen, hair sticking up, blinking sleep from her eyes. "Why are you up?" she mumbled. "Because I have a phone call to make," he said simply, "and I want you to hear it." At 7:03 a.m. he dialed the number from the letter. Pamela picked up on the second ring. "Good morning, Mr. Hartman." "Morning," Charles said. His voice was steady. "You asked for an answer." "I did." "We accept," he said. "I'll take the job. Amelia will join the summer program, and will relocate to Brighton Heights after her school year ends." There was a brief pause, and then Pamela's voice came warm, confident, and clear. "Excellent decision. I'll have HR start your onboarding today. Expect a formal packet by end of the week. And congratulations, Charles. I have a feeling this is only the beginning." When the call ended, Charles turned to Amelia. She was smiling so wide, it looked like it hurt. "We're really doing this?" He nodded. "We're doing it." The days that followed unfolded in a strange blur of motion and emotion. Word spread through the trailer park like wildfire. First whispers, then curious glances, and then open speculation. One of the kids who usually ignored Amelia at the bus stop asked if she was really going to a university summer program. One of the moms at the laundromat made an awkward comment about people moving up. And then there was Warren Schmidt, standing across the street with a wrench in one hand, watching them with narrowed eyes. Charles didn't wave. He didn't need to. That weekend, Benjamin Lopez organized a farewell cookout. Nothing fancy, he'd said. Just burgers and goodbye. But it turned into something more, a celebration, a recognition. People who had never asked more than a nod from Charles now wanted to shake his hand. They offered congratulations, compliments, and the occasional awkward admission that they'd always thought he was too smart for this place. Mrs. Peterson, who'd once paid him in casseroles and kindness, brought an apple pie and gave Amelia a hug so long it bordered on maternal. "You're going to do great things," she whispered. "Your mama would be so proud of both of you." The most surprising visit came 2 days before the move. Angela Foster, Amelia's science teacher, arrived with a gift-wrapped frame. Inside was a photo of Amelia working on her project in the school lab and a certificate of her state science competition entry, beautifully mounted. "You're one of the brightest students I've ever taught," she told Amelia. "But more than that, you never gave up. You kept going even when the world gave you every reason not to. That's what makes a great engineer and a remarkable human." Charles stood in the doorway, watching the exchange, a lump forming in his throat. He'd always wanted to give Amelia a life of stability, of opportunity, and now she was standing in the middle of it, on the threshold of something he'd once only dreamed of. That night, as they packed the last of their things into the rented trailer and loaded the truck, Charles stood inside their now empty living room, lit only by the soft glow of the porch light. He could still see the echoes of their life here. Amelia studying at the kitchen table, Sarah's laugh in the walls, the countless nights spent crunching numbers, fixing broken things, waiting for a break that never came. Until now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Sarah's wedding ring, the only valuable he'd never pawned. It was scratched and worn, but still beautiful in the soft light. He held it between his fingers and whispered, "We're going to be okay, Sarah. She's going to be more than okay." The next morning, with Amelia buckled into the passenger seat and the trailer packed, Charles took one last look at Woodbury Meadows in the rearview mirror. He didn't feel bitterness, only gratitude for the struggle that shaped him, for the neighbors who'd shown kindness, and for the long, winding road that had led him right back to who he was always meant to be. As they pulled out onto the highway, the sun broke through the clouds and painted the road ahead in gold, and for the first time in a decade, Charles Hartman drove forward, not with fear, but with purpose. Brighton Heights welcomed them not with fanfare, but with the quiet, polished confidence of a place that expected excellence as the default. Their temporary apartment was nothing like the trailer they had left behind. It was sleek, modern, and smelled faintly of new carpet and lemon oil. It sat on the 4th floor of a glass-paneled building, with a balcony that overlooked a city skyline painted in silver and blue. Charles stood there on their first night, mug of tea in hand, watching the sunset disappear behind the distant horizon. Amelia had fallen asleep just an hour earlier, curled up with her university packet still spread out beside her. The city lights flickered on below like signals sent to the stars. He had made it here. They had. The following morning, Charles arrived at Woodward Technologies for his first official day as Director of Innovation. The marble lobby was quiet, but alive with purpose. Engineers and designers moved with measured speed, each absorbed in something greater than themselves. He was greeted by an HR rep who handed him a sleek security badge, a company laptop, and a welcome kit filled with branded materials that somehow made the surreal real. There was no waiting period, no slow onboarding. Pamela wanted him in the innovation lab by 9 o'clock sharp, and as the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, Charles felt the weight of his new title settle onto his shoulders like armor, not a burden, but a mantle. The team was already assembled when he walked in. Jason Reynolds stood near the Pulse prototype, smiling nervously. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, the formidable head of electrical systems, gave him a nod that carried both challenge and respect. Mark Thompson from Mechanical Integration offered a firm handshake, and Sophia Chen from Materials Science raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Let's see what you've got." Charles took his place at the front of the room. Pamela, standing off to the side, gave him a subtle nod. It was time. He didn't start with a speech. Instead, he went straight to the prototype schematic on the digital board. "I reviewed the specs over the weekend," he began, his voice calm, assured. "We've got a 12% efficiency gap between projected output and field performance. Most of that loss is happening during thermal transition." He paused, let them absorb it. "My suggestion is simple. Instead of overcompensating with hardware, let's reprogram the control system to anticipate the energy spike before it happens. We preload the secondary capacitor, reroute the overflow into the passive loop, and decrease thermal shock by almost 30%. There was a moment of silence, then Vasquez stepped forward. "You think the predictive model can react fast enough in real time?" "If we rewrite the signal architecture and lower the latency threshold, it can," Charles replied. "But we'll need to redesign part of the firmware. Jason, you're good with that, right?" Jason lit up. "Absolutely. Then let's get started." Over the next few hours, the room transformed. The skeptical energy gave way to collaborative momentum. Engineers who had guarded their projects like fortresses now shared ideas freely, bouncing insights off one another as Charles guided the flow. He didn't command with volume, he directed with clarity. He asked questions, listened carefully, and then offered solutions that made others excited to contribute. It wasn't long before Vasquez stood beside him, sketching a redesign of the power conduit that built off his concept. By lunchtime, they had a working simulation of the new system and an outline for prototype testing by Friday. When Pamela returned, she found the team gathered around the digital board, watching the thermal imaging from a test model that already showed a 17% improvement. She didn't interrupt. She waited until the simulation ended and then stepped forward. "It's working?" "Better than we projected," Vasquez answered. He wasn't bluffing. This approach might actually push us ahead of schedule. Charles downplayed the praise. "It's a team effort. All I did was shift the lens a little." Pamela turned to the group. Effective immediately, we're increasing the R&D budget for Pulse Phase 2. I'll handle the board. You all focus on doing what you just did, only bigger." Then she turned to Charles. "Walk with me." They stepped into the corridor, leaving the buzz of the lab behind. "You've made quite an impression," Pamela said. "Henderson called me this morning. He wants you to present the prototype to the board next month." Charles raised an eyebrow. "The same Henderson who called me a mechanic with a lucky fix?" Pamela smirked. "He says you're the kind of engineer who makes everyone else nervous, and that's exactly what we need." They returned to the executive floor, where Pamela handed Charles a sealed folder. "Inside, you'll find access to the sealed Davidson files, the hybrid patents we acquired in that lawsuit. I figured you might want to look through them. You might recognize a few ideas." Charles took the folder and held it for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, voice quiet. "I might." That evening, as he walked into the apartment, he found Amelia sitting at the dining table, notebook open, laptop glowing. She was scribbling equations, murmuring to herself, fully lost in the problem-solving zone. "Hey, Professor," Charles said with a grin. "Save some of that genius for the competition." She looked up, her face flushed with excitement. "Dad, the university wants me to present my project to a group of visiting engineers tomorrow. Real industry partners. They said my data might have real-world applications for low-cost combustion efficiency in underserved regions. Can you believe that?" Charles pulled out a chair, sat beside her. "Yes," he said, "I can, and I'll be there. Front row." They worked late into the night, side by side, her refining her presentation, him reviewing the patents Pamela had handed over. And sure enough, on page 16, he found it. A thermal regulation algorithm nearly identical to the one he had developed a decade ago, the one Davidson had buried. His name wasn't on it, but the lines of code might as well have been written in his own handwriting. He didn't feel rage, not now, only validation, because this time the ideas were his again, and no one was going to take them away. The next morning, as Amelia boarded the university shuttle, Charles stood outside the apartment with a cup of coffee, watching her wave goodbye. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Pamela. "Henderson wants your Pulse redesign plans by 3 p.m. Also, lunch next week with the CEO of Greystone Energy. They're watching closely." He took a sip of coffee, let the warmth settle, then he smiled. He was back. Not just with a job, but with purpose, with pride, with a future that he'd rebuilt, bolt by bolt, not just for himself, but for his daughter and for every dream he'd once shelved and left to rust. The days ahead would be full, demanding, maybe even brutal, but they would be his.